Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. The election of Avi Lewis as leader of the federal New Democratic Party, with about 56% of the vote on the first ballot, is a small political earthquake. Since 1961, the NDP has been the party of social democracy in the Canadian state, though it's usually been very weak in Quebec. Like the leaders of its counterparts in other countries, although more gradually than some of them, the NDP's leaders came to accept neoliberalism, diluting the party's politics down to what, in some other parts of the world, is often called social liberalism. The party was gravely weakened in the 2025 federal election, in which it drew only about 6% of the popular vote, down from about 18% in 2021, and it elected only 7 MPs, down from 24 the previous election. As a result, it lost official party status in the House of Commons. This year, Avi Lewis was clearly the most left-wing of the 5 candidates who ended up on the ballot, and he was definitely not the preferred candidate of most of the party's establishment. Among the people who joined or rejoined the NDP for this leadership race were a considerable number of radicals who only joined so they could vote for Lewis. NDP membership is about 100,000 people, which is down from around 125,000 people at the time of the previous federal NDP leadership race in 2017. Interestingly, this time about 71,000 people voted, up from about 66,000 in 2017. So the turnout was about 70% of the paper membership, compared to about 55% back in 2017. So there's a new leader at the helm of the federal NDP, and there's lots to talk about. I'm very glad to be joined on this episode of Victor's Children by 2 guests. Could you introduce yourselves to listeners?
I can go first. Hi, I'm Deena Newaz. I am based in Toronto. I've been organizing in the Labour movement as both rank and file and as elected member and a coordinating member of the Spring Socialist Network. I'm so happy to be here.
My name is Martin Lukacs. I'm a journalist and the managing editor of The Breach, an independent left-wing media outlet here in Canada. And I'm also a longtime collaborator of Avi Lewis's and was an advisor to him during the campaign, and also a longtime listener of this podcast, David. So very happy to be here.
Thanks both. So first, I'm going to ask you a question, and remembering many listeners to this podcast are not in Canada. Martin, can you summarize what the platform is that Avi Lewis ran on?
Yeah, maybe perhaps I could describe the contours of the campaign beyond its strict, policy platform. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think the campaign engaged in what's typically called a left populist communication style. It drew a line of antagonism between, a broad, diverse working class we and a narrow them. And it was forthright in naming, the corporate culprits behind our crises, the grocery giants, the big banks, the tech oligarchs, the oil barons, all of them enabled by a liberal conservative alliance. This was embodied in one of the campaign slogans, "For the many, not the money." And I think that connected with a, pre-existing perception among Canadians, 2/3 of whom, according to the polls, believe the economy is rigged in the interests of the rich and powerful. In terms of policy, the campaign proposed a series of eco-democratic socialist or eco-left social democratic policies that could be easily understood to meet the pressing material needs of people. So that included using public ownership to create affordable options for food and phones and internet, as well as postal banking and a public pharmaceutical company. It included a massive build-out of public housing with public developers and free and functional public transit. The campaign called for major reinvestment in public services like head-to-toe healthcare, or what the campaign called the care economy, so elder care, child care, education. It also revived the Green New Deal framework, which had its roots in previous advocacy that Avi and I and many others did with the LEAP manifesto, and that tried to embed climate solutions like getting off fossil fuels, not building more fossil fuel infrastructure in policies that improve people's material quality of life. So whether that's a huge amount of unionized climate jobs or more affordable heating. And that was all to be paid for, according to the campaign, by wealth taxation and other forms of increased taxation. There were other policies too, principled, opposition to war in Iran, the genocide in Gaza, the opposition to the construction of a war-oriented economy, which is what we've seen under Carney, migrant and workers' rights, critical approach to regulating AI and big tech, and so on. But the eco-socialist, I think, was core to what the campaign offered. And then I'd say the last, probably interesting or most important dimension of the campaign was an explicit orientation to mass organizing. And that was embodied in what the campaign did, it built 15 or so regional organizing chapters. They were uneven in terms of capacity and political development. But they emerged through the campaign, were supported by a centralized organizer team. There was also a relational organizing program that helped people, kind of modeled off of the big organizing programs that Bernie used in the States, that helped people connect with family, friends, colleagues. And there were ways we gamified it as well, which was fun. People would get points on a leaderboard, depending on how many people you contacted, signed up for the party, turned into donators or volunteers. There was also political education that happened through mass online calls, organizing calls. We did what were called solidarity sessions, where Avi, on mass Zoom calls, was in conversation with organizers from migrant rights, Palestine solidarity, trans justice, the labor movement, and other things. And that orientation to mass organizing, I think, was also part of a pledge for democratic reform within the party, which would involve opening up the party to the energy of its grassroots, turning the EDAs, the riding associations, into organizing hubs that could get implicated in wider struggles. And it was also there, I think, in Avi's clarity, which is probably unique among Canadian politicians, that electoral politics cannot be the be-all, end-all. That we can accomplish very little unless popular power outside the party is also considerably built up. And we characterized the party's role as functioning best as a parliamentary wing of a broader common front of social forces that would have to encompass more militant labor unions, more powerful social movements, and a more organized working class.
Deena, is there anything you'd like to comment on about these issues?
No, that's really helpful. As someone who's outside of the NDP and also not as directly involved in the campaign as Martin, that's helpful to hear sort of as someone who's been directly involved in the orientation. But not much else to add, but we'll also add that, as I mentioned, I'm a part of Spring, which is a small revolutionary socialist organization, and one of our role is to build the confidence of the working class to build mass movements. So it was those aspects of the Lewis campaign that is really exciting, but also animated a lot of our members as well, is sort of taking principled stance and building something around anti-war and against the genocide in Gaza. So nothing else to add on there.
So let's talk about what made Lewis's win possible. It certainly was not because there was a sizable organized left wing inside the NDP before the leadership campaign. And listeners may not know if you don't follow the NDP closely, but the left within the NDP has long been very weak and not organized really at all. So how do we explain this outcome analytically?
Well, I think the federal establishment of the party was considerably weakened by the loss of party status. So if your listeners don't know, the party was reduced to just 7 seats, and that meant that it lost millions of dollars of resources that usually go to building out or having a research office, an organizing office. And so on one hand, like the lack of resources that the party had, and as well as major debt in the millions and millions of dollars, made it a much less attractive prize, I think, for a potentially more formidable establishment candidate, such as, for instance, a former mayor or a former premier. And I think that weakness, frankly, also made it harder to engage in the sort of sabotage that we saw when Anjali Appadurai ran to be the leader of the BC NDP in 2022. If she had won that, she would have automatically become the premier of BC. And in that circumstance, the establishment really closed ranks and made a very determined effort to disqualify her. And one of the ways they did that is they created new rules in that leadership race midway through the race, so they could disqualify her on the basis that environmental organizations had mobilized their ranks to sign up, 10,000 members for her. And that meant that the membership rolls were skewed in her advantage, and rather than try to have a fair runoff, they simply gerrymandered the rules to DQ her. I think in Avi's case, because of his family background, he comes from, a political dynasty. His grandfather was the leader of the National Party, and his father was Stephen Lewis, was the leader of the Ontario Party. He, I think, had more mainstream and institutional credibility, so it provided a kind of dynastic cover for an insurgent campaign. And I guess the other element is that, David, you mentioned that the left has not been very well organized within the NDP, and I think that's true. But I think there was a considerable base of members within the party that wanted a left-wing turn. And, we saw evidence of that back in 2016 when the membership at the convention in Edmonton had voted for the LEAP manifesto, which at the time I think was a stand-in for a kind of Bernie-esque turn in the party. So this time around, there were small groupings like Reclaim and Renewal that were trying to act as a kind of organized current within the party, though I do think you're right that there has not been a well-organized current in the party. But I still think a sizable number of people, probably in the tens of thousands, who wanted that left-wing turn. And I think outside the party, as you mentioned, the campaign was able to activate a layer of left activists who wanted a national political representation of their broad left politics, something the NDP has not really been. It was challenging for organized formations to get involved. Having, for instance, learned the lessons of the Anjali campaign, the establishment, in this case, prohibited from the very outset any kind of collaboration between the campaign and movement organizations, which are known as third parties in Canadian electoral law. But all the same, I think lots of individuals from disparate movements got involved, either in the campaign itself or in simply signing up themselves or signing up comrades and friends. And I think the last thing I would say factor is that I think the campaign tapped into an appetite for, joyous, militant, collective action that has been rarer on the left in Canada, especially in the post-pandemic period. Like Avi carried himself as a kind of happy warrior, even when he was going up against the corporate elite. There was, for instance, a video that I helped produce of him going down to Bay Street in Toronto and engaging in, sometimes quite humorous banter with representatives of the financial elite. And I think people who showed up to campaign events, I don't know if either of you had a chance to do that, they discovered that they were, filled with fun and humor and a lot of music. And I think that's something that sometimes is missing from rather grim events on the left that we host.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that question, sort of to understand Lewis's win, I guess, from my perspective, it's like the weakness of the NDP, which has been pointed out, is very real, but that also did create the room for Lewis to step to the left as well. And this is undoubtedly a good thing. We want, in these moments of crisis and weakness within the NDP, folks to be not sort of moving more to the center to win disaffected folks, but also taking these principled stance on the left. But there were also other types of weaknesses in this leadership race. Sort of, there weren't a lot of viable candidates running. Only one had an elected seat, which is quite unique. And as a party, as both of you have alluded to, has lost a lot of its roots in the working class as well. And sort of the negotiations that come with sort of being rooted in the class and the contradictions within the class as well. And so this is a good thing and this is a real opportunity, but also how we can have also sober analysis of some of these weaknesses, which Lewis and the folks in the party will be confronted with. And I'm sure you've all also come across the Angus Reid poll, poll where over 1,100 past NDP voters were polled, and over half of them didn't recognize most of the candidates on the that were running for the leadership. And some of the sentiment fell true in sort of a lot of labor organizing or anti-war organizing outside subway stations of just regular workers, and they weren't tuned into what's happening at the NDP as well. And these are all problems that can be fixed, but I think there's a general weakness that allowed him to move left, but those weaknesses can also now will be a real formidable challenge to sort of rebuild those roots, rebuild the image of the NDP as a worthwhile companion in struggle for the working class, for the folks outside of the NDP and outside of the sort of the activists who were sort of desperate for an opening in what feels like defeat after defeat on the left.
I think that Angus Reid poll I found it interesting. To me, it cuts both ways. It's not just an indication of weakness, but of opportunity. The fact that, for instance, members of the NDP as well as Canadians more broadly don't have a fixed impression of someone like Avi Lewis, I think is something to be taken advantage of. It means that we have a chance to make an impression and to, I think, reach people outside of their preconceptions. So I actually find that quite exciting.
So, Deena, I'd like to ask you just to take a step back and just share your view about what the significance is from where you're standing politically of Lewis becoming the leader of the federal NDP.
Yeah, absolutely. And Avi Lewis's victory, or this sort of outcome of this leadership race, it's a real opening for the left. As socialists, we're optimists and we believe radical change is possible. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing what we do every day. And I think it's also a rejection of NDP's social democratic light politics of the last 3 decades or more that has not delivered not only electoral success, but any real material success for the working class who are struggling to make ends meet. So it is seen as a real opening for the left, and as socialists who are organizing in our trade unions, in our workplaces, in our communities. However, it would be somewhat a mistake to think that the wider class or the working class that have been disaffected to the party, but also more generally disorganized for whatever reasons, will automatically support more robust social democratic demands, let alone socialism. And as everyone here who's organized for many years, there's nothing automatic about sort of winning people to those bold ideas in the campaign, but also more broader ideas that we want to win around anti-war and on sort of against austerity, which are real threats. So I guess as socialists, we believe people's ideas can change, but that can only meaningfully happen through direct struggle, through involving people directly in sort of transforming their own conditions, whether that's fighting their bad bosses, fighting their bad landlords, or sort of targeting the enemy at home. And it cannot simply happen through an electoral project, which, Martin, you also emphasize. But right now, what is missing on the left here in both Ontario, where I'm based, but also in Canada, is those large-scale mass movements and a militant labor movement that can give expression to the best ideas in the NDP right now. We simply don't have, sort of those mass movements we need for Avi Lewis's idea and the NDP's ideas to land within the working class. So in essence, what we see there's a lot of work to be done. And for us, our method remains from below organizing, focusing on the rank and file, the folks that are increasingly alienated and feel out of touch with not just the party, but also their own trade unions. And we saw a glimpse of that even in this leadership race, where we had labor union leaders endorsing candidates, but couldn't bring their members, and these are elected leaders. So there really is a crisis of sort of from below organizing, including the rank and file in all of their mixed sort of political consciousness. And that remains, I guess, for us, the most important task is to build that base, because without a base, a party can't achieve much. And this base is not just a group of people who all agree on these ideas or who get on with each other. A base or a mass movement is is most importantly extra-parliamentary and independent. They have to be independent so that they can continue to sort of build the forces and bring in the people who did not vote for Lewis, did not vote for even the NDP, who remain disaffected. So what we urgently need is these independent extra-parliamentary movements that can make arguments along class lines, and that ultimately is transforming consciousness of workers where they are rooted, so they feel confident to be doers in their own social context, not just doers in the sense that we get the right leaders elected in our trade union or get the right folks elected and they will deliver us the change or deliver us the outcomes, but workers who feel that they are the agent of change in their own workplaces. And that work will only strengthen and embolden the Lewis win and the Lewis campaign as well. But we also cannot wait for the reformed NDP or this campaign alone. We continue to build this independent sort of mass organizing and mass movements and focusing on the labor movement as well, which is, despite its sort of flaws and weaknesses at the moment, is one of the only structural democratic organizations that can pull hundreds of thousands of workers, many of whom don't like each other, don't even agree with each other, but have the structures and the resources to fight for sort of their collective demands. So that work has to be done. That's been a big focus. That continues to be our focus, so that these independent extra-parliamentary movements can be the wind in the sails of sort of a Lewis-led NDP. And as socialists, this is not going to be a surprise to anyone. We remain skeptical of a pure strategy of parliamentarism and electoralism leading to socialism. But at the same time, we don't turn our backs towards the project either. We encourage sort of the left to think bigger in this moment, to broaden that project that has made these gains and has brought Lewis to the leadership, but how we can reach even wider audiences with our ideas and get in and continue in the business of changing people's minds and hearts wherever they're rooted, and seeing them as co-companions in struggle. Otherwise, I feel, are doomed to repeat the mistakes we've seen in the UK, we've seen all across Europe, that an electoralist strategy that aims to simply take over and manage the capitalist state in order to reform it bit by bit is doomed to sort of abandon socialist transformation and also abandon the people who are excited and drawn into the movement. So that's how we are at the moment relating to this and building those extra parliamentary movements.
Martin, what's your take on the significance of the win?
So there are a lot of strands in what Deena was saying, and hopefully we can pick a few of them up. I agree with much of what she said. Just maybe one thing to add in terms of the significance would be to zoom out and look at the longer arc of the NDP's history as well as its precursor, the CCF. And to me, one of the things that's remarkable about this victory is that it is the first time the left has won leadership of the party. And I don't think that should be discounted. There have been many left challenges within the party dating back to its very origins, but they have never succeeded. I mean, one can think of the Socialist Party of Canada, which was, part of the initial CCF coalition. It was ultimately marginalized, including by, ironically, Avi Lewis's grandfather, David Lewis. We can think back to the Waffle left nationalist formation in the party in the late 60s, which ultimately was purged by Avi's was purged by Avi's father, Stephen Lewis. And then, of course, there was probably the last left leadership attempt to win the party was Sven Robinson's. For people who aren't listening in Canada, Sven was a democratic socialist MP, the first openly gay MP, real trailblazer as a parliamentarian. And his campaign in 1995 was defeated through a kind of orchestrated campaign by the establishment, which probably no surprise to your listeners was also led by a Lewis. In this case, Avi Lewis's uncle, Michael Lewis. So to me, it's a delicious kind of historical twist that the Lewis legacy has, in terms of the leadership of the party, often been one that shored up the power of the centrist and right-wing social democratic wings of the party. in more recent years, in recent decades, the New Politics Initiative was an effort to try to reinvent the party as a fusion of social movements and electoral politics in the wake of the rise of the anti-globalization movement in the late 90s. That too was defeated at convention in, I think, 2001 or 2002. And then most recently, we mentioned the LEAP Manifesto earlier, which was probably the first left effort to win a convention, but then it wasn't backed up by the thrust of a leadership campaign, which meant that the establishment of the party was able to smother the energy and it didn't accomplish anything ultimately politically. And so, after many generations of efforts, with, quite, propitious kind of circumstances, this left effort finally succeeded, and I think that's worth celebrating and seeing in the long arc of things.
Thanks to both of you. Now turning back to look at the what's next, based on your understanding of the circumstances, what do you think Lewis's next moves will be in terms of changing the party, moving forward within the party?
I mean, just to pick up on some of the stuff that Deena was mentioning, I agree that to simply maintain the same kind of party form, but with better politics, on paper, won't succeed. So I think if the party maintains its kind of, electoralist focus, which it has almost exclusively done for the last few decades, it is bound to fail. I do think that one of the things that the campaign started to do in the leadership campaign portion was to start trying to politically construct, a sense of popular unity, or to use Gramscian terms, like a historic bloc. Start to try to weave, if not yet connective tissue, then certainly like ideological tissue between different constituencies that I think could represent a political majority in this country. Asset poor members of the working class, racialized and indigenous communities, downwardly mobile graduates, and I do think that kind of ideological construction is an essential part of doing what an NDP needs to do to be helpful more broadly. I do think that, and I think this is where a shift is most needed, is ensuring that the party tries to construct popular power. So it tries to stimulate and amplify wider struggles, whether that's, valorizing the work of rank and file militant labor unions, which certainly do exist in Canada, but are few and far between. Sparking more experiments and cooperative economic development, of which Canada certainly has a long tradition, encouraging the spread of tenant unions and other kinds of, popular power and left institutions that we are in desperate need of in this country. And then I think the last is definitely trying to do the work of a electoral political party, which is build a majoritarian program for government that can address people's fundamental needs in this era of escalating crises, and just become a lever for mobilization towards that governmental alternative. We're obviously starting at a very low point in popular power. Civic life in this country is incredibly weak. It's not even what it used to be in past generations. Deena mentioned the labor movement, which is should be our strongest political anchor. It is the most democratic force of disruption in our economy, has mostly suffered defeat after defeat over the last few decades. And so to the extent that the party can validate and valorize those struggles, it will be incredibly important. So we need more labor militancy. We need expanded tenant unions. Like one thing I've imagined is like, what if we sent the membership of this party door knocking for tenant unions or helping build towards a climate strike? And so I think it is really crucial not to get stuck in an electoral focus, cheerleading for Avi to merely go up in the polls, to imagine that the NDP can succeed if it just refines its policy playbook. The key really is to try to create outlets for popular political participation, both within the union and to catalyze that work outside of it. And if we don't do that, then, it will be impossible to defeat the countervailing powers that we will undoubtedly encounter, even in these earlier stages, and certainly in the longer term, like if the NDP ever has a chance of actually contending for office.
Yeah, and just to chime in there, and I think, you rightly point out some of the structural challenges as well of a party and of being in a parliamentary project as well, because absolutely, I don't say this from a place of pessimism that our movements are weak. I say this in a place of, and there is work being done, but that work, if it's truly from below, because what my concern often with sort of building social movements or building these kinds of mass politics is those shortcuts that often come up when there is a moment of opportunity and you want the movement and the forces to be there to go hand in hand with sort of a parliamentary project. And we've seen this elsewhere as well. There is a tendency for shortcut where there is a lot of substitutionism, where the working class, which the NDP represents and is a voice for workers, they're not organized, their confidence isn't built, there aren't robust training programs where they're able to fight where they're rooted sort of outside of sort of party mechanisms. And there's a lot of substitution of agendas and policies being sort of handed down. And that weakness is evident when there are mass movements or mass coalition rallies, but a lot of rank and file are missing. They aren't there. The numbers aren't there, which on textbook there should be. So that is, again, a structural problem that can be fixed through sort of doing the outside party building and the independent organizing. But I guess it'll be interesting to see how the party and Lewis is able to balance sort of the discipline of electoralism, where you do have to stay elected and win and drive out votes. That's the machine of electoralism. But then there is also the work, the bold stances that need to be taken to build anti-war initiatives like we are seeing right now, sort of in its very nascent stages in Canada against the war on Iran, and what is, an increased escalation with no end in sight, and how, I guess it'll be interesting to see how a party that also has to do its business, but also builds in a moment of weakness, these initiatives or build picket lines that are popping up across the country and are weak for various reasons as well. So it is, I guess I often sort of arrive at, the tension between the electoral discipline and also how much can be done through a party and through a progressive platform or even a leftist platform to transform mass movements as they're being built and nurtured from below.
Yeah, I think undoubtedly the discipline of electoralism will be an incredibly difficult obstacle to contend with. I also think that, some of the things I didn't mention, and I know it was part of the campaign's platform, and in fact was something that was endorsed by the party membership at the convention recently in Winnipeg, was to create what's called a permanent organizing model for the NDP. Of course, it's much easier to say that than to do it, but my hope is that what resources can be found in a party under incredible debt would be devoted to the kind of member trainings, organizer trainings, political education throughout the EDAs and throughout the membership that can bring some of that, deep organizing that we've seen in certain labor unions in this country, and which has been quite successful into the party. I don't think that's been done, and it will be an interesting experiment to see how much can be accomplished, while also, as you say rightly, Deena, contending with some of the demands and pressures that a party like the NDP will be under to perform electorally. Though I think sometimes I get frustrated with the phrase no shortcuts, which I obviously agree with on a political level, but I sometimes feel that becomes an alibi for not taking advantage of seizing the moment, such as the moment that was afforded to us by this opening in the NDP. And I think it's possible to recognize that there are no shortcuts to building electoral as well as popular power, while also not just sitting on our hands in a moment like this one that affords itself.
So this brings up the question, I think, of the opposition that Lewis is facing already, and it did not take more than a few seconds from the moment of his win being announced before it really broke. But more generally, what kind of opposition he's facing, what kind of opposition he's going to face, and from whom, both inside and outside the party. So you start talking outside and then talk inside as well. I think we need to understand both of those because, of course, they're related to each other in terms of how they function.
Yeah, you were chuckling about how, I mean, to my understanding, some of the distancing from some provincial sections like Alberta and Saskatchewan happened even before Avi Lewis had been announced as the new leader on Sunday in Winnipeg. So there's this backlash that's underway, both from moderate centrist forces within the party, as well as many reactionary forces outside the party. Besides attempts by the Saskatchewan and Alberta sections to distance themselves from Avi and to suggest that he, is anti-working class. There were, talking heads in the corporate media, pro-Israel lobby groups, organized hard-right extra-parliamentary groups that were already trying to denounce and degrade Avi and the new party. Lots of red baiting, false accusations of anti-Semitism, which of course is a trademark part of the playbook of establishment forces in recent years. I think if we see any rise in the polls for an Avi-led NDP, those attacks will eventually extend to the broader corporate and political elite. I call this kind of backlash a beautiful backlash. Because I think we've seen establishment smears of this kind boost the strength of insurgencies. We certainly see that play out in the initial periods of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, as well as Bernie Sanders' primary challenges. The elite who unleash these attacks, they tend to inadvertently draw even more attention to their targets' positions. They underline their, anti-establishment credibility, which is attractive to many people. And they also fire up their base. And so I think in each of these cases, as, the attacks from these establishment forces grow, so too does their popularity. And then on in this kind of ever-intensifying cycle of hostility and broadening appeal. So I do think it's a mistake on the part of the establishment to so outrageously attack him. I think it's going to be to our benefit. And I think the key on Avi's side is to hold the line, is not to give an inch, not in terms of the politics and policies that he ran on and won a huge mandate for. And I think if he can hold the line and not do what I think so many people either expect or are used to politicians doing, which is start to water down, make concessions, moderate in order to, maintain his position. I think the popularity and strength of this moment will just grow.
And I guess from my perspective, again, I've been seeing sort of the opposition already emerge both from inside the house and outside. And it was inevitable, of course, as we've all anticipated. And these challenges will only accumulate, especially when confronted with the challenge of working with the provinces, like you mentioned, like Canoe and EB, who become caretakers of the capitalist state. And those contradictions will present itself. But even thinking about sort of the best way to overcome this kind of opposition is through their movements, through independent movements, and through raising the level of political consciousness and confidence of the class through action to defend the Lewis administration or party. And that has been the only method that has worked, thinking about the Corbyn project as well. When he was being attacked by his own party on Brexit and on anti-Semitism, there was various tendencies to ignore it or silence critique. But the only successful way there was upticks in his popularity was when there were mass movements, independent mass movements on the street after the Syrian war broke out. There was mass mobilization on the streets, and that was the energy and that independent credibility ability, what he was able to leverage, and he did sort of win quite a significant amount of votes in 2017. So all of that to say, to your point, Desmond Martin, it's to be bold and holding the line, and the only way to challenge opposition and challenge that kind of power from the ruling class, because it is inevitable, is through a bolder vision that is also supported and upheld by wider sections of the class. And I know we agree on that. It's just sort of the how to build that, and that is the real slog. As I think about in unions, to convince our workers, our colleagues, our peers to do something that is in our collective interest quite immediately, takes quite a lot of time. And to do that more broad in a mass way, building the confidence and the training, that will become key to withstand this opposition as time carries on. And we've seen this here in Canada as well, that it was these mass movements that come to the rescue when the best of the class are being attacked. And it's ultimately mass movements that pressure governments to take bold actions and not the other way around. And it's constantly keeping that relationship alive. And we've seen that with sort of Palestine solidarity. It was movements that pressured governments to do something bold about it, to varying degree of success, of course. But it's that relationship that will embolden and overcome some of these oppositions that will continue to come.
So if we now change our focus a little bit and think about the federal Liberal government's agenda of austerity, resource extraction, and massive increases in military spending. Earlier this year, Montreal-based organizer Mustafa Hanawi wrote in an article in Midnight Sun magazine that, in his words, the strategic question now is how to build a mass, multiracial, working-class resistance to Carney at the scale required, capable of sustained confrontation. So I'm interested in your responses to that argument about what's key, whether you agree with it, and where you see the NDP located in relation to the challenge that's posed by Mustafa there.
Well, maybe one way to take this question is to say that I think that before, Avi's campaign started and he became leader of the NDP, I think the prevailing attitude among leftists in Canada was what we might call like movementism. Ignore the NDP, I would say rightly, because it was such a moderate, highly centralized, party whose ideological outlook, as you mentioned, David, earlier, was a kind of liberal light or the most accurately social liberalism. The consultant class who ran the party looked to third way UK politics or corporate democratic politics as its model, had a very rigid electoralism and was usually ranged from like skeptical to openly hostile to social movements. And so I don't think movements thinking about how to build a mass resistance to a right lurching establishment liberalism would have found an ally in the NDP. I think that has changed now, and I do think that I hope that we broadly on the left can have a more mature, sophisticated debate about the interplay between parliamentary resistance and movement resistance to an agenda like Carney's, because I think Carney provides a very target-rich environment. I think that he has been able to engage in a kind of shock doctrine politics in a moment of mass disorientation and shock because of Trump's attacks on our politics. And they have, speedily moved rightward on so many key fronts. I think that will eventually people will start to feel it in their day-to-day lives as that austerity agenda trickles down in more and more cuts at the provincial levels. And so I think there is a huge opening for a left that understands that we now have a parliamentary front for our resistance. So I worry still though that like much of the left will stay focused on base building in their small quarters, focused exclusively on social movement organizing. And if those efforts remain detached from the kind of national infrastructure I think that a left-led NDP can provide, they'll continue to be ignored or repressed when necessary by the government of the day. And so I think having a leader like Avi with the kind of bully pulpit of that this position affords him, I think is very important. Like I think most people's experience of politics is structured by electoral politics, and so I think there are millions of people who can be reached by an electoral party that can't be reached by groups on the left, whether organizations like Spring or, outlets like The Breach where I work at, we're reaching very small audiences. And a socialist-led NDP can reach millions, can champion and amplify movement perspectives, can act as a popular lever of mobilization. I think back, for instance, to more concretely, like the coalition that a fledgling coalition. I don't know if Spring was involved with it, but the Draw the Line coalition, which was, I think, the first signs of, more mass mobilization against the Carney agenda. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but they must have brought out tens of thousands into the streets, through actions across the country. And I think, coalitional organizing like that against Carney, which is absolutely necessary, I think will be, significantly strengthened by the political leadership that an Avi Lewis NDP could bring into the picture, in sharpening our critiques and our attacks, as well as the alternative that we pose to Carney. And so, yeah, I think we are, on much stronger footing than we were a few weeks ago. And I think the opportunities to advance like a popular left alternative to a de facto liberal conservative coalition is quite significant.
Yeah, to jump in on the federal question, and again, it's absolutely brutal what the Carney government is sort of, raining down on folks. I used to be previously a federal public servant, over 40,000 cuts, complete decimation of entire union locals, bargaining units. And that's just a small sort of window into the wider project of austerity and militarism that we're seeing. So, the stakes couldn't be higher. And of course, we do need a broad sort of pan-Canadian coalition to be uniting, of course, NDP, but also everyone outside of the NDP, the broader sections of the class, and broadening this fight to give expression to sentiment that everyone's feeling. When I'm organizing, everyone's feeling they can't afford anything. Life sucks. Life's only getting worse. And we don't need to tell that to people. People know it deeply. But it's also giving expression to that sentiment, and how to give expression to that sentiment, is the question. And of course, the vision of a socialist-led or a left NDP would be great, but right now that example does not exist. So when I'm organizing in my union, when I'm organizing outside of bus stops, and when we are seeing lots of activated young people who are sick and tired of not being able to find a job in what is one of the largest unemployment crises in this country right now, what we should provide is easy, accessible pathway for activity that builds confidence. And in that way, I don't see social movements in any tension with electoralism, because going back to something, Martin, you mentioned earlier in this sort of conversation, is that it's a part of the bigger picture. Electoralism is in the whole thing. It's a part of it, and it's strategically engaging with it when there is the opportunity to relate to it, or having their resources and the power in parliament relate to it. But right now we're not there yet. So what we are seeing is, okay, let's maybe form a rank and file caucus in your workplace. Maybe this is something we can do by doing a petition campaign, because it's those little activities that builds the confidence to do broader coalition work and to do broader sort of work in other places as well. And the goal isn't, of course, for small organizations to lead that front. Like when I organize, the goal isn't come join this tiny socialist organization, because that's not helpful, because we don't want more perfect leftists. We want the masses being drawn to these radical ideas, but also believing they have a role to play in doing something about it. And I think that may be sort of the sentiment, is that, yes, there are these issues. There's austerity. The Carney government has money for militarism, but no money for childcare, no money for anything we care and love. And let's do something about it, versus sometimes the electoral pitch becomes, isn't this really bad? Things are terrible. Let's sort of mobilize ourselves to support someone who can do something about it in parliament. And I think that is the kind of electoral ask that can sometimes be quite disempowering for lots of workers, is that you think I'm an agent of change, but my power stops at helping someone get to the right places of leadership and doing something about it. So all of that to say, I think what is needed are those sort of workplaces, militant workplaces, where people understand the enemy at home and are engaged in fighting them every day, whether through passing resolutions or in neighborhoods or through tenant organizations. When they see a bad landlord and advancing this agenda, they're able to know that there is a place for them to do something about it. And it's essentially the kind of radical from below training for people to become doers in their social context. And eventually those are the exact same people who are going to fill whatever activity there is to advance the fight on the electoral stage, but outside of it as well. So I guess I've been trying to push back on this tension that often comes, that there's a hostility, or at least from my perspective, a hostility between movements and electoral project, because one can't exist without the other. Without movements, you will be attacked and you will be defeated. And that's true within unions as well. It's easy to win an election without a union election where like 5% of your membership doesn't show up. But it's staying in power and doing anything meaningful rather than just being someone who chairs lots of meetings. And this is from personal experience as someone who got there too soon. And there wasn't vibrant sort of fights for Palestine solidarity, fights for sort of against austerity and job cuts. So I was absolutely useless because I couldn't do anything besides chair meetings and go to committees and give resources, of course. So for me, it's not either or. It is sort of the building blocks, the confidence for something broader. And my concern there comes from the fact that I do go to a lot of these events. I do go to a lot of, and this is self-criticism as well, is it's often the same people. It's the same layer of activists. It's the same layer of organizers. And for me, real success would look like at all levels, both electoral and the projects outside, is are we able to draw in large numbers of new people that represent the working, that are the class, and are we able to sustain them as well and give them a vision that's broad, because if the vision is very closely linked to the party that's in its early stages of being something, sometimes the defeat of the party or defeat of the leader becomes the defeat of you, and hope is on short supply, and we want to make sure that there is something broader to fall back on as well, but also to defend the electoral project, because you're absolutely right. We don't turn our back on electoralism. We meet people there, the class, we meet them there as well. So that's how I see the relationships between movements and electoralism, but also the building blocks that needs to happen as well in giving expression to the sentiment against widespread austerity in this country.
I guess maybe I would maybe push Martin on one point. I'd be interested in what you have to say about this, because I think you made it on a very articulate case for where the NDP might be, or where we would like it, might like it to be in relation to the strategic task of building working class resistance to Carney. But that's not where the NDP is now, right? So, what's your response on that? I'd be interested.
I do think that the fact that the party has been so reduced in its lack of official party status now, and a widespread understanding that it's like slow slide to the center over decades, means that now there is a chance for, and even something of a consensus for renewal. So I think even, for instance, the establishment slate at convention for the governance bodies of the party, which was arrayed against an anti-establishment slate of people like Libby Davis, who's a longtime left-wing MP in the Vancouver downtown east side, and other social movement activists. In that situation, even the establishment slate had to pass themselves off as supporting bottom-up renewal, democratization in the party, because they knew that that's where the prevailing mood was. And so I think now that there is a a widely recognized mandate to make some of these kinds of changes. Of course, naturally, there will be pushback both from the provincial sections of the party, which are, intertwined constitutionally with the federal party. And so, yeah, certainly I agree that it's one thing to project this kind of vision for the party, and another to actually, build the personnel within the organization, find the resources to do these things. But I'm hopeful that we have a moment and an opportunity for this work. I also think the fact that Carney now has secured his majority through a kind of slow drip floor crossings means that we may not have an election for a few years rather than having one this spring or this fall, which I think would have exacerbated some of the contradictions, Deena, that you rightly refer to. It would have meant that there would not have been a chance to do the kind of, slower organizational rebuild that the party needs to fulfill this kind of vision that I've articulated. Avi, for instance, has already telegraphed in the media that, in contradiction to the pressure that is already coming from the mainstream media, the establishment media, to immediately find a by-election that he can run in. He's made it clear that just like Jack Layton, actually, he's going to take his time to find a seat to run in, and he plans to be touring the country, hosting major events and town halls, interacting with not just the party membership, but the broader, constellation of social movements, and really trying to catalyze and stimulate those wider struggles that are key to the success of the left and also the success of the NDP. So I think, some of the conditions are right to make this kind of effort. Obviously, it will run into obstacles, but I'm hopeful that we can make some inroads.
So this takes us to a question, and you may disagree about this. I'll be interested to hear what you say. Direct question. Do you think socialists and other anti-capitalists, like people who are listening to this podcast who are not active in the NDP, should now start putting in time to being involved in their NDP electoral district associations and other party bodies?
I mean, I actually don't think there's a consensus on this within the organizers who were involved in the Avi Lewis campaign. I think there are many people who do want leftists to flow into, riding associations. That's not my position. I think that would be a mistake for a few reasons. One is I think that in many cases, electoral riding associations are not a welcoming home, whether it's because they're dilapidated or don't even exist, or because there is a layer of professional staffers with the provincial parties that tend to run them, or a kind of, just right-wing social democratic old guard who run them, especially in the more competitive ridings. And so I think it would be a mistake and likely an alienating experience for many, especially of the young socialists and leftists who got involved in this campaign. My personal hope is that a movement organization emerges out of the campaign, akin to what activists in the UK built after Jeremy Corbyn's campaign was successful. The organization was called Momentum. So I personally would like to see an organization emerge that has a campaigning orientation outside the party, that can engage in political education, that can take positions to the left of the leadership of the party, but that can also operate as a kind of an organized current within the party, a faction even, to drive the project forward within the party and defend it against its detractors and opponents. And also, importantly, I think build an independent basis for left-wing politics to hold Avi accountable. I'm obviously very fond of Avi, but I think it's important to recognize that individual politicians come under huge amounts of pressure, inducements to moderate. And I think we have a situation in this country where we don't have a strong organized left. That was the basis for this electoral run. We don't have a DSA, which laid the foundation for Zoran Mamdani's run, and that also had mechanisms, imperfect as they may be, to hold politicians like Mamdani accountable, to sanction its member electeds, as we've seen them do with like Jamal Bowman or AOC. So I think I'm worried, speaking openly, speaking in a more like open way, that we don't have that movement anchor for this, and it means that this project is weaker than it ought to be. So I think that an organization, a momentum-like organization, could strengthen and cover for some of these inherent weaknesses, and I think also play a role in helping those young left-wing people and otherwise who might want to go into their EDAs. But create a political home that's more attractive culturally, and be a place that actually advances the kind of, synthesis of electoral and popular organizing that we've been talking about. I think that's obviously, even if Avi were to agree with that, like I think it's much harder to do that as the leader of an electoral party. And so I think I would like to see an organization like that advance a more inside-outside strategy. So I'm sorry if I didn't create an opportunity for stronger disagreement, because I can imagine, Deena, that your spring will not be encouraging people to flood into EDAs. But I think people should, like, ultimately, I think, because there are left-wing candidates to nominate, and there will be opportunities, hopefully, for training and education that a new left-wing party offers. But I think it would be a mistake for them to just flow in a way where they are not organized nationally to be supported.
Yeah, and to chime in, I guess what can, and I know the activist hubs are sort of transforming the riding association is exciting, because I know lots of folks that I know here in Toronto who are engaged or want to be engaged and don't know how. So it is definitely an exciting proposition. I guess, and not to sound chicken and egg, but I guess it's harder to bring new people in or people outside of the NDP camp, because it's with them, it's show not tell. Well, why should I join this place? And I think that is, and at least a kind of organizing we do at Spring and as Socialists is not come, trust us, join us, and things would be better. But it's like, this is something you're encountering in your neighborhood, in your workplace, in your current housing situation. How can we support you in sort of creating actions to fight where you are rooted exactly? And that being the starting point as to how you fight back, which is essentially from below, rank and file organizing. And as it stands right now, it's hard to make those arguments for anyone to go to someone who's not in the NDP fold already, which is the majority of the class, to say, hey, come join something that doesn't quite exist. But unless there is sort of how does this relate to their current conditions and material conditions, and what is the basis to fight together with? And of course, that will take time. And there are lots of structural challenges, which we talked about as well. And I also appreciate the criticism of sometimes leader-centric politics as well, on the left, and sometimes that places the real agent of change outside of the class, outside of all of us, that this leader will deliver, and inevitably leaders break your heart because they are confronted with the crisis of capitalism and managing sometimes capitalist pressures or managing capitalism themselves. And that's why sometimes broadening it beyond sort of the leader and even sometimes beyond sort of machinery of the party becomes so essential to the health of the project as well. You mentioned the DSA. Even within the DSA, there's not a lot of political clarity, and there's a mass sort of every now and then mass exodus of folks who feel like they're a reformist project rather than something more revolutionary as they aim to be. So this is not new or not inevitable, but it is, a lot of the success of these projects also lie on the health of external organization and this work that continues, where the class feels like they're doers wherever they're rooted, because ultimately they would be the folks leading some of this or becoming co-companions in the struggle with the riding associations, with the NDP and everyone in between and outside.
Yes, and I think since you brought up the DSA, Martin, it's worth thinking about the fact that, of course, there hasn't been any phenomenon like that, right, in the Canadian state. Has made a big political difference. I would put it a little bit differently in terms of the experience about trying to hold DSA elected officials accountable, in the sense that, for example, when you mentioned Jamal Bowman, but in fact, the response to attempt after he took a funded trip to Israel, right, the attempt for people involved in the Palestine BDS movement inside of DSA to hold him accountable led to essentially the leadership dissolving the BDS working group, and as Deena was saying, like an exodus of a whole layer of people involved in Palestine solidarity from DSA when it seemed to become clear that the central leadership, at least in a very amorphous, in some ways decentralized organization, nonetheless there are centralized power holders who were committed above all to their relationship with the elected officials, who have, are the DSA members or have a close relationship to DSA. So I think that experience is worth learning more about and thinking about when it comes to people who are going to be active in and around the NDP.
I guess that's what I meant by that. Unfortunately, the mechanisms for accountability are imperfect.
And you mentioned momentum in Britain, and that could also be the basis maybe for another episode of this podcast to learn more about the experience of what happened there, because I think that raises something Deena touched on around the dangers of a kind of cult of the leader, which I think was, Deena, you could probably speak to this from your experience in Britain, the kind of reticence, to say the least, about criticizing Jeremy Corbyn, right? That was there on a lot of the Labour left, and I think that was very was detrimental to the Labour left itself, and more broadly on the left. And the challenge about I would be very, very happy to see the emergence of some kind of new radical organization that operates as a political organization inside and outside the NDP. But what kind of organization that would be, how democratic it would be, what its relationship to struggles on the ground would be, how much would it be oriented towards fighting inside the NDP over policies and procedures and those kinds of things. There are a whole lot of questions that people in this country have very little experience dealing with. But people, for example, in Britain have a lot more experience, good and bad, that we can learn from in relation to what happened when Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. So do either of you have any thoughts you'd like to offer on those kinds of issues?
I think mostly just that the right approach, considering our lack of experience at that level, is humility. I will be the first to admit that I think in this era where the left has experienced defeat after defeat in Canada, I don't think any of us have set and compelling answers to these questions. And I think what I'm excited about is that the Avi Lewis campaign winning means that at least we have new openings and opportunities to experiment with. But I agree with you, David, that there are very important questions to think about and resolve over the coming days and months.
Deena, is there anything you'd like to add on those questions?
Yeah, we can definitely talk about sort of the projects elsewhere. We can talk about, of course, momentum in the UK and the Corbyn project and now your party, and which sometimes it feels like as a class. So, and as socialists, sometimes, just to backtrack a bit, sometimes as socialists, I think one of the best things we can do in a socialist organization is be memory of the class. These challenges of these tensions that we're talking about, these structural challenges, they've presented themselves over and over again. And the best we can do is learn from the lessons and the failures and all on what could have been, while also not underestimating the pressures of capitalism as well. But what we saw with the Corbyn project, just to mention, is why something outside of the party is so critical, and these mass movements are so critical, and why we're always on and on about building the rank and file to be doing the thing they need to be doing so that they're not tethered to a leader, is because what happened with the Corbyn project is, after he was absolutely destroyed by his own party, we saw sort of the complete demoralization and disintegration of a lot of sort of groups and hubs, and all the people that were brought to sort of support Corbyn just left the realm of political organizing and left. There was massive demoralization. So was I, extremely demoralized. And we can't afford to do that every few years when a leader or a party breaks our heart, which is inevitable under the pressures we live under. So that's why we constantly focus on extra parliamentary, while also relating to the best parts of electoralism, and we never abandon it. And there is a possibility where the NDP under Lewis becomes sort of this mass party where socialists see it as a place to join and to add vibrant layers to the party. But right now, the key focus feels like bringing new people in beyond the folks that we already know that exist on the left. I think an organization or a riding association would be absolutely toothless if it's just a bunch of us leftists sitting in there and trying to direct work. But a real vibrant organization is where are you able to bring new workers who've never been in a political organization but are sick and tired of their conditions, and the goal would be bringing those folks in to withstand the upheavals of sort of some of as electoralism as well, without any personal fault of the leader sometimes. And it'd be great to also talk about what happened elsewhere, like in Greece and with Podemos in Spain. There are lots of lessons to be learned, and maybe that's for another time.
If I could just pick up on, I was chuckling when you used the phrase "break our hearts," because I mean, one of my hopes is that we advance a kind of clear-eyedness. I do think like there is a prevailing view, and I'm not suggesting you have this view, but I think it's just evoked by the phrase that like that we are meant to have kind of, you know, like a personal relationship with a party, you know, and sometimes like, you know, they're like a bad boyfriend or a bad girlfriend or whatever it might be, like that they represent our politics perfectly, you know, or should. And I think my hope is that I know the politics that Spring advances, and I think the politics that this campaign was trying to represent is that should never be our conception of a party, that a party is an institution of, you know, divergent and varying politics, and we should struggle, you know, to advance our politics through it as the terrain it is, you know. And I think my hope is that that the kind of politics that Avi was practicing as well, which was trying to encourage people not to place their hope in him as an individual politician, but to always remind people that the party, even under his leadership, will only be as strong as the power that we build inside and outside. And I think in that kind of, you know, situation or scenario, we will steel people for the fact that you know, Avi may end up moderating. And if that happens, it won't just be his fault; it will be the fault of those of us who haven't built enough power on the outside to make sure that he stays the course.
Which I think just underscores the importance of organization, right? Of political organization, that electing a new leader to the NDP may create certain opportunities, but it's certainly, you know, at best the beginning, right, of broader change. And so hopefully we'll be able to revisit in future episodes to just, you know, discuss other initiatives which have not yet gone public or have not yet, you know, developed to the point where we can have a conversation about them, but hopefully they will arise and then they'll pose new questions. And I do think that you both have made an important point that I think I'd like to link together, separate points, but the importance of humility, right? Because this is a genuinely new experience, and we need to actually be open to learning from it and not assuming that it's simply going to replicate things that have happened elsewhere. But at the same time, there's the danger of a kind of, and I'm not accusing either of you of this, but of naivete, right? Where people who haven't actually really studied what's happened inside other social democratic parties in the past won't, you know, people who may not recognize some of the forces that are at play and might think more just in terms of people, personalities, and so on. We need to, I think, be both open and have that humility, but also be as deeply informed as we can about past experiences, because, you know, there are going to be some quite, I think, familiar dynamics, even if they're manifesting in novel ways as we go forward. So thanks very much to both of you. I'll mention it, Deena, since you just mentioned it in passing. In a future episode, hopefully very soon, of Victor's Children, there's going to be a discussion which includes a member of Anticapitalistas from the Spanish state, which was an organization that emerged out of the experience of Podemos. So I'll be able to offer that to listeners possibly as the next episode. But thank you both, Deena and Martin, for your thoughts on these questions.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, David, for having us, and lovely to chat with you, Deena.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcasts wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.